Okay, so now that we have a better idea of what WebSockets are and what they can do for us in our note sharing application, let's see how to actually add WebSockets to our front end and back end. So to get started here, we're going to add WebSockets to our back end, and we're going to do that using a package called socket.io. All right, this is sort of the standard WebSockets library for front end and back end. It makes it a lot easier to work with WebSockets than if we try and do it with some other library or without a library at all. So we're going to be using socket.io. Socket.io is the backend package, and it has a front-end package as well that's a little bit different called socket.io client. All right, so we're going to be using both of these, this one on the back end and this one on the front end. So let's get started and install socket.io into our back end. So we're going to go into our backend inside of a terminal here. Oops, cd back. There we go. And what we're going to do is install that package by saying npm install socket.io. All right, and now that we've installed that, we're going to open up our server file, and we're going to see how to add WebSockets to our server. So first of all, adding WebSockets to our server is going to require us to use several packages besides socket.io. The main one is going to be the HTTP package, which is included in Node.js by default. So essentially what we need to do here is create a sort of wrapper around our Express application here that will know how to handle WebSockets, right? Because an Express server, right, an Express app by default doesn't really know how to deal with WebSockets. There's not a default way built into Express to do that. Okay, so creating this wrapper, as I said, is going to be done using the HTTP package. So let's import that here. We're going to say import HTTP from HTTP. And then what we're going to do is underneath where we create our Express app, we're going to say const server equals http.createServer. And we're going to wrap our Express app inside of that. So essentially what this does is it creates a basic HTTP server based off of the Express app that we're setting up here. All right, and the only reason we have to do this is because socket.io by default doesn't specifically interface with an Express app, and that's to help it avoid depending on other packages. So we're just converting it into a basic HTTP server. Don't worry too much about that process if you don't understand it. And once we've done that, we're going to say const io, and here's where we actually create our socket.io wrapper around this server. We're going to say const io equals socket.io, and we do need to actually import that up here. So we'll say import socket.io from socket.io. And then we're just going to wrap our server in that. So we're creating a new I.O. wrapper around our socket.io. Now, the way that this I.O. thing works, again, don't worry too much about this process we just went through. The point here is that the way this I.O. thing works is actually very similar to the way that we define routes on an Express app, right? In an Express app, remember, we say things like app.get, and then we have a path here, and then we have a callback function, of course, that gets called whenever we receive a request on this endpoint, right? A GET request on this endpoint. So the way that I.O. works, the way that this I.O. object we just created works, that is instead of saying things like app.get, app.post, we just say I.O.on, and the first argument here is the name of an action that can occur via that WebSocket connection. All right, so the most common action, the most common event that can occur here is called connection. And what this connection event means is that a new client just connected to our server's sockets. All right, so that's the name of the event. And additionally, again, this is pretty similar to how Express does things. The second argument here is going to be a callback function that gets called whenever that event occurs. Okay? So this is sort of how we set up our WebSockets. And the nice part about it is that we get to define our own actions. So we can say, for example, something like io.on, and if we want to have our own event for, let's say when a note is updated, we could say note updated. And this, of course, is going to contain extra information inside of it that was sent along with this request. Okay, we're going to see what that looks like a little later. But essentially then, inside this callback is where all of the logic that we want to execute whenever that event is sent through is written. Now, again, the nice part about this is that our server, in addition to being able to receive these events, can also trigger these events, right? So if our server wanted to trigger one of these events on all of the clients, then it can do that. We'll see what that looks like in a little more detail later on. But essentially what we're going to want to do first is we are going to want to say io.onConnection. So I'm just going to uncomment this. And when something is connected, when a client connects to our server, we're just going to log something out to the console. We'll say console.log, and we'll say a new client just connected. All right, so that's the basics of listening for WebSocket events. The next thing that we're going to have to take a look at now is how to have our front end actually connect to our server with a WebSocket. So I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.